Whenever someone raises the question of why Switzerland was left untouched during the Second World War, the answers are quite limited to buzzwords like, well, there was something about gold and money, the Swiss economy, the Swiss army, and so on and so forth.
In this video, we will answer this question in more detailed way and show that there was even active fighting between Switzerland and the Third Reich, of which hardly anything is known today.
So why was Switzerland left untouched? We were neutral. Thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to the next time. Of course, it's not quite that simple. I mean, neutrality did nothing for the citizens of Denmark, or the Monegasques, or the people of San Marino. One big factor, and probably the most well-known one, was the economic interdependence with Germany. Fortunately for the country, at the time the only route through the Alps available that can be used all year round was the Swiss Gotthard train line. Just look at a map of Europe. The Alps stretch from east to west over 1,000 kilometers. Until long after the war, the Gotthard train tunnel was the only efficient transit route for freight transport between northern and southern Europe. Switzerland's connection to the world has been either the port of Genoa in Italy or the port of Rotterdam up in the north. So it was clearly in Switzerland's vital interest to not interfere with this transit. Because of this situation, Germany and Italy were also enabled to transport goods smoothly across the Alps throughout the whole war.
And a glance at the map reveals another vivid reason. After Germany managed to overrun France in less than 8 weeks, Switzerland was completely surrounded by Axis powers. This left Switzerland in a much less favorable position from a Swiss point of view.
Während die Armee unsere Grenzen bewacht, müssen Bauern und Städter immer größeren und aktiveren Anteil nehmen an dieser Wirtschaftsschlacht.
During World War II, food scarcity was Switzerland's most pressing issue. By 1941, Switzerland's food supply was on the verge of exhaustion. The government, nevertheless, rose to the occasion. While only about half of agricultural land had been cultivated before the war, this climbed to 90% by 1942. Every available piece of land, even inaccessible mountainsides, were soon tilled. In the early 1940s, Switzerland had been largely self-sufficient in foodstuffs, but by the war's end, it had come to rely on imports from abroad. Imports from other nations made up 1/3 of the food supply. Switzerland was also responsible for ensuring that their allies had enough food, with 1/6 of the nation's cereal production being sent to Italy, for example. In all, during World War II, the Swiss were compelled to provide an extra 150,000 tons of meat and 40,000 tons of fat and oil, above and beyond what they produced previously.
The Swiss government was quite tight on export limitations. Food items could not be exported if it threatened to disrupt the country's food supply. This meant that, even during periods of severe hunger, such as in 1944, no person in Switzerland starved.
So, let's conclude. On the one hand, there was no real need to invade Switzerland. Germany's military forces were tied up in a war on multiple fronts, which at no time would have allowed forces to be withdrawn for what was actually an irrelevant and neutral country. On the other hand, there was the gold, the other more inglorious factor. During the war years, the German Reichsbank sold gold worth more than 1.2 billion Swiss francs to the Swiss National Bank. In 2021, this equals to a $4.3 billion in just 5 years. Not only is the National Bank not just a private bank, but the central bank of the Swiss Confederation. And according to all evidence, it is considered certain that the directors were well aware about the fact they are buying up looted gold. From a German point of view, it would be nonsensical to attack the state to which the looted gold was sold.
The economic ties, the geographical location, the guarantee of the transport of goods between Germany and Italy, as well as the blood-stained business with Nazi gold were the main factors that kept Switzerland from being occupied.
But what's about the Swiss army, you may ask? In the post-war generations, it was taken for granted that the deterrent strategy of the Swiss army was instrumental in keeping Germany out of Switzerland. In the meantime, however, we know that this strategy represents a vanishingly small factor, if any at all.
Today, the collective consciousness has changed. Most Swiss citizens are roughly aware of the reasons we discussed earlier, but with this realistic view on that the economic was the much more important factor, people increasingly began to misrepresent the role of the army and its so-called reduit strategy.
And this strategy gets often misrepresented today. People are quick in saying that the army was hiding in the Alps and the population was left to the enemy. Or people generally laugh at the fact that anything was planned at all. Germany could not have been defeated. Yes, of course not. No officer, not even General Gissen himself, believed that they could have done anything against the strongest army on the planet at the time. As General Gissen himself emphasized, it was only a question of selling one's life as dearly as possible. This is also reflected in the reduit strategy, because it is not as if the army had completely entrenched itself in the Alps. 9 border brigades of 10,000 men each were planned to slow down the penetration at the borders. Behind them, depending on the year and the danger of the situation, several brigades and divisions were planned to slow down the enemy even more. There were always far more than 100,000 men earmarked for the defense of the flat part of the country, and all these delaying forces would have fought to the last cartridge. And then there was the system of militia army. Each adult man has had its own rifle at home. This was to ensure that an intruder would never come to rest. It would create a situation comparable to the Afghanistan conflict of the last 20 years. The country would not be brought under peace. The criticism that the population would have been exposed to the enemy is therefore fundamentally not true.
By using mainly infantry men as delaying forces, the devastation caused by an invading force would have remained much smaller than if all the defensive forces would have been mobilized somewhere in the flat Midlands, where the Wehrmacht could have destroyed them easily. This strategy should deter any potential attacker, not in the sense of they are afraid of our superior strength, but in the sense of if you take us, we will make it as disgusting as possible for you. We will entrench ourselves. We will make entrances, bridges, and roads impassable. We will block the important north-south transit. We will use the Alps as a natural defensive wall, and you will have to wear out a lot of material and eventually losing soldiers, just for the manageable importance of Switzerland. So you'd better not do it. You'd better make an arrangement with us. That was the message. And quite honestly, what other strategy should Switzerland have been used? By the time the Second World War began, Germany had 4.5 million soldiers. These were more troops than Switzerland had inhabitants. And when Germany overrun Yugoslavia and Greece in 3 weeks in 1941, the Swiss assessment of its military strategy had proven correct. In a low mountain range, there was nothing to oppose this German Wehrmacht, nothing at all. The Swiss army strategy was understandable, but fortunately it never had to be put into practice, which doesn't mean that Switzerland never became militarily active.
May 1940, Hitler's Western offensive was in full swing, exposing our Western neighbors to frequent bombardments and fierce air combat. The Swiss airspace surveillance recorded dozens of airspace violations, mainly exercised by German bombers who used shortcuts over the Swiss territory on their way to France and back. As a result, the Swiss Messerschmitt 109s, at that time the most modern combat aircraft of all, are launched to intercept and ultimately shoot down the invading aircraft.
Switzerland, with its agile Messerschmitt 109, had a clear advantage over the rather lumbering bombers. They were so successful that the commander-in-chief of the German Air Force, Hermann Göring, and even the Führer himself, Adolf Hitler, felt compelled to threaten neutral Switzerland with retaliatory action.
General Gissen reacted to this with a general grounding of his fighter planes. From now on, enemy air squadrons that violated Switzerland's air sovereignty were greeted by the guns of the Swiss anti-aircraft defense. In total, the Swiss Air Force knocked 11 German military aircraft out of the sky. At the same time, the Swiss side has counted a loss of 3 planes. However, due to the quick end of the Western campaign, the interventions by the German Air Force came soon to an end.
But there were also British and US bombs that fell on Swiss territory. On the 1st of April 1944, at about 11 o'clock in the morning, aircraft of the American 44th Bomb Group dropped 400 bombs on Schaffhausen. The attack, which lasted just 40 seconds, set half the town on fire.
Am 1. April 1944, gegen 11 Uhr morgens, warfen amerikanische Bomberstaffeln Brand- und Sprengbomben auf Schaffhausen ab.
Considerable damage was caused from the banks of the Rhine River towards the railway station. The original medieval town center got destroyed, and same was happened to the southern part of the town. The fire brigade was everywhere trying to fight the fires. But there were too many. Irretrievable cultural assets were destroyed, 34 persons died, around 100 got injured, and 450 persons got rendered homeless as a result of this catastrophic event.
Although many conspiracy theories persist up to these days, after the reappraisal of the cases it is undisputed that they were mistaken drops. The accident in Schaffhausen, for example, can be said to have been caused by very bad weather over Great Britain and especially over France. The actual destination, Ludwigshafen, is about 200 kilometers to the north. Stormy winds pushed the squadron off its course. The relatively new radar technology failed, and the pilots had already lost their orientation somewhere over France territory. Among other things, the logbooks written from pilots clearly show that fact. The Schaffhausen incident was only one of 66 mistaken bombardments of Swiss territory, but it was the most serious incident. During the war, 84 people died in Switzerland as a result of bombs getting dropped by accident. As ugly as all these incidents were, at the end it turned out that they were only accidents and not intentionally directed against Switzerland.
So far, let's conclude the main reasons that prevented Switzerland from experiencing the terror of the Second World War. There has been the strong economic ties with Germany, the guarantee of Alpine transit between Axis powers, the difficulty of the geographical location, the unexpectedly swift defeat of France, and finally, the blood-stained dealings of the Swiss National Bank. All these factors combined have prevented Switzerland from a German occupation.
Now, since you made it that far in the video, we'd like to ask you, did you receive some relevant information from this video? Should have Switzerland reacted in a different way? By the time, was it okay doing business with the Nazis? What's your opinion about Switzerland and its role during the Second World War? Leave us a comment. We'd like to hear about you.
At the end, we hope you found this video interesting. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.